Well, good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Andrew McElwain of the Heinz Endowments, and we're pleased to bring you our afternoon session, which will conclude the day. And before going into my session, I owe a great debt of gratitude to a couple of individuals I do want to thank. Donna Evans-Sebastian has been our event manager today. She is the magician behind the scenes, making it all happen. So please give a big shout out for Donna and all the work she and her team have done. I also owe an intellectual debt of gratitude for what we're going to work on this afternoon to Tony Griffin of the Harvard University School of Design. And she put a lot of time in to the planning of this event, and I'm very grateful to her for it. Also, a shout out to our program officer in the sustainability team, Matt Barron, who put tremendous effort into this event. Thank you, Matt. And also to the Heinz Endowments communications team, I want to acknowledge all the good work they've done today and throughout this event. Our afternoon session is on the Just City and a Just Pittsburgh. A Just City and a Just Pittsburgh are very important concepts for P4 and for us on the staff at the Heinz Endowments. And we feel it's something that everyone should want. In looking at the definition of just, it is fair, unbiased, even-handed. It is moral and ethical. It is reasonable, sensible, and sound. And that seems to me something we all should want, that should be something we embrace without hesitation. Putting it into the context of Pittsburgh as we re-urbanize, as we see the city grow, as opportunity returns after too long an absence. Just Pittsburgh might include several things we've talked about over the last day and a half. It would be a city where development is equitable, where opportunity is shared, and all people are, in Angela Blanchard's term, welcome and included. A Just Pittsburgh and a Just City would widen our circle beyond just our immediate neighbors and our immediate family. It is a place where the success of the individual is the success of all. And a few other things, taking away both what I've seen here and some observations. A Just Pittsburgh would also be some place where no one is disadvantaged by race, gender, by who they love, or any other barrier that we might put in their path. It is a city unafraid of differences, one that is not livable until it is livable for all. But it also would address other injustices, such as poor air quality and failing water quality, or failing schools. The benefits of redevelopment would be broadly shared as the city grows again, especially with those who are already living in the communities under redevelopment. And it would also value its creative soul, nurturing the arts and the culture of the community. But most of all, as we've heard from a couple of speakers, it comes from a place of respect and of affection. My longtime board chair and mentor, Teresa Heinz, once said, "Places are what people dream." And it's been a pleasure dreaming with you the last day and a half. Someone who is also inspirational and gave us a sense of opportunity yesterday and who has helped us to dream about the future of Pittsburgh is Liz Ogbu of Studio O. And Liz is going to lead us through the next phase of our work. And so, Liz, if you are ready, I would like to call you back. Let's see where she got to. Here she comes.
Sorry about that, last-minute organization. So I'm really excited about this session that we're about to do, and I just realized that I ran out of here without a clicker. If somebody could bring a clicker to me, that would be great. So the joy of coming out after lunch is that I have to somehow keep you awake. So thank you. So I'm just going to deliver a couple of remarks to get us started with this session. And then you are actually going to do work at your tables. And I'm going to be joined by facilitators with Maya Design, who will help coordinate the session. But first, I wanted to start with a little story. And it may seem weird that I'm here in Pittsburgh and I'm showing you a picture of Australia. But for those of you who have had the pleasure of talking with over the last 2 days, you've heard me talk about the fact that I actually have spent the last 2.5 months living in Australia. I just got back to the States 5 days ago and then turned around and came here. I was an architect in residence with the Australian Institute of Architects, and the project that I was charged with looking at was the degree to which marginalized populations, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, immigrants, and refugees had been integrated into community development practices in the country. And as an overlay, I was also looking at issues of race, power, and privilege, and how that played a role in the positionality of these groups. And so, if you've ever been to Australia, or if you haven't, I'll just say it's really interesting to try and continually ask questions about race in that country. And so whenever I would ask people, tell me about the condition of racism in Australia, oftentimes, particularly from white Australians, I would get the response that, well, you know, we have some issues with the detention camps in Papua New Guinea, and there's some issues up in the north. So the dark blue highlight is the Northern Territories, which is perhaps the one place within Australia that you have the greatest percentage of an Indigenous population. But then I would hear that within Sydney and Melbourne and the other cities, they were fine. And I scratched my head, and for the first couple of weeks, I thought maybe I'm just a brash American who's totally obsessed with issues of race, because their description was very different than my experience. I found that most of the time within Sydney, it took a couple weeks before I realized that a lot of the people of color, particularly the immigrants and refugees, were out on the western edges of the city where you really couldn't see them unless you purposely tried to go to see them. And I experienced some sort of racist experience probably once every week or 2 weeks while I was there. And so while the statistics say that actually the cities in Australia are some of the most diverse in the world, and the multiculturalism project that they have actually has had a lot of success, it occurred to me that statistics don't always tell the story. And that often what we have is that there's a difference between our technical understanding of race and equity and an experiential understanding of race and equity. Of course, the stats say that there is an incredible amount of diversity there, but that doesn't mean that an experience in a city, when I walk through and I am keenly aware when I get followed in the store or when somebody says a racist insult at me, of what it is like to be the other, and I negotiate my experience in the city as a result, that's different than a statistic that says, but we have X percentage of these groups here, so we're in good shape. Statistics also could tell you some of this other part of the story, where actually over 80% of white Australians do admit that there is such a thing as racism in the country, but only 40% think that there is such a thing as white privilege. So that difference in trying to link what is our technical understanding of things to what is our experiential understanding is what we're about to talk to today. And I think that sometimes when we're talking about how do we shift our institutions towards looking at issues of race and equity, we focus on the statistics because that's what allows us to make rational, objective decisions. But the experiential piece, the qualitative piece, and some of the stories we've already started to hear over the last 2 days start to speak to the fact that that's important as well, and that's a data set that we need to be mindful of. A former colleague of mine once remarked that stories are data with a soul. So what I want to do today is figure out how we can share more of those data stories and how to do it at the level of you as the individual. So I'm going to ask for the purposes of this session that you put aside your organizational hat. And if you remember the challenge that I gave at the end of my talk yesterday about being human, we're going to do an exercise in exploring each of our individual humanity and how that might come to bear with some of the larger issues that you guys are talking about. So I introduced the concept of empathy yesterday, and essentially what we're going to do are explorations into empathy. And there'll be a series of guided exercises that you'll do individually, in pairs, and then as a group as a result of that. I did want to share as part of that a couple of quotes that I think are helpful as framing questions or framing thoughts. So this is my first time in Pittsburgh. And in order to try and wrap my head around the conversations that you guys were having, I read some of the many, many, many reports that you guys have had produced. And I also talked to a couple of people involved with the conference. And so when I found this quote a couple of weeks ago, it struck me as, that seems to align somewhat with some of the things that I've heard. And then since being here, I'm like, yeah, that definitely seems to be on the mark. But this quote actually came from a writer who lives in Charlotte. And she was being interviewed by a reporter on NPR in the midst of the unrest there a couple of weeks ago. And I share it in part to say, well, the issues here are not unique, but also to sort of prompt how can we start to think about a place that is integrated not just by the numbers who happen to live in the city, but by the actual experiences that people in the city have. And so as you reflect on the questions that we have today for you, I hope you'll think about that how can I take my own experience and begin to talk about what an integrated experience across the city might look like. The second quote is another one that came to me as something that I would have wanted to share with you guys today. Many of us in this room have heard the Martin Luther King quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And so I went and, consulted Professor Google to try and find the quote because I wanted to make sure to get it correct, and then ended up reading the entire letter from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King, which is where the quote is from. And just as an aside, I would say if you've never read it or it's been a long time since you've read it, I would strongly encourage you to read it again because it's actually pretty salient to the time that we happen to find ourselves in right now. But what I found really interesting was reading the entire paragraph in which that quote was embedded. And so injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere is actually, it's a great sentiment. But similar to when we sometimes talk about issues of race and equity, it can seem something that's still somewhat removed from our daily reality. And so I was struck by the last sentence in the paragraph, which says, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And it seems that there's great alignment with the introduction that Grant gave yesterday about the fact that we are all affected by these issues, whether you are someone who has been followed in the store or heard some racist comment towards you. And so part of understanding what that effect is for us to begin to delve into our individual stories. And it's not anything that's actually comfortable, and I think that that's something that's come up quite a bit over the course of the last 2 days. It's actually really uncomfortable because nobody wants to really talk about this stuff. But if we don't face things, even when they're uncomfortable, we'll never actually get past it. And sometimes when we have these conversations, there can be a tendency to treat it in very binary terms. So the people of color are supposed to feel the burden of being oppressed, and the white people are supposed to feel the burden of guilt. And what I want to say is that it's not that that doesn't exist. Of course, it is the reality. There is a burden that comes with being the one who always has to go through the issues. And there is a burden that comes from the guilt, whether or not you do something directly or not. But what I would love that we can think about in the course of this conversation today, and then also as you leave here, is how to not let those burdens paralyze us from being able to move forward. How can we think of this not as an either or, but a both and, that this is part of the simultaneity of our existence. and that in order to move forward, we have to claim ownership over it and build and move forward. I was reminded today of when I was talking to someone earlier about one of my favorite quotes, which is by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, that says, "I am not an optimist, but I'm a prisoner of hope." And so these things are really challenging, and sometimes they can look quite daunting. But I hope through the series of exercises that we do today, which bring it a little bit more down to the individual level, we can start to actually see what some of that forward movement might be. So I'm going to very shortly turn it over to Christy Woolsey, who will assist me in facilitating this. But first, whenever I do these kinds of workshops, I have a series of community agreements that I ask that the room be governed by. It is not easy for me to come up here and tell you about times where I experienced racism, but I treat that as part of my personal work that I have to do. And much to what I said yesterday, that part of being human means us learning to be open and be vulnerable. And if I'm asking you to be open and vulnerable, I need to first be able to do that myself. And when I am vulnerable with you, when anyone who has been here over the last 2 days has shared any of their story with you, they're actually putting some element of trust that you will hold space for them. And so these are just some guidelines to help us continue to enforce a trustful space over the course of the next hour or so. And so the first agreement is to listen actively and compassionately. So sometimes when someone's telling me a story, I start thinking and racing ahead to like, oh my God, that makes me think of X, or I can't wait to share my own story. And what I want to ask is if we can all just shut down that little voice in our head, and for the moment that somebody is sharing something with us, that we become a little bit of a sponge. And for that moment, we're just there to listen deeply and intently to all of the words that they have to say. I also request that we all use I statements. So if Judy shares her story with me, and then we happen to be in a group setting, and I'm like, oh, Judy had this great experience that happened to her, and she did this, this, and this. Judy's story is not my story to share. That's for Judy's story to share. I can say, Judy said this, and it inspired me or reminded me about X, and that's okay. So let's respect everybody's ability and opportunity to share their own story. Respect each other and yourself. Every voice is equally important, and this connects to the next one of self-moderate, step up and step back. So I am sure there are a lot of opinionated people in this room. We all have things to say, and we're all used to being leaders. But if you find yourself at the table hearing your voice a lot, you are hearing your voice a lot. And so I would ask that you take a moment and step back, and just even leave a pause for somebody who's maybe not so quick to jump in to be able to speak. And if you find yourself having never said anything, it doesn't mean that there's pressure to say something, but I hope you will feel that this is a safe space and that your voice, your opinion, it actually has value and we want to hear it. Transcend binaries, explore intersections. So intersectionality was brought up yesterday. The interesting thing of my time in Australia is that I knew that any moment that I opened up my mouth, I automatically would vault from someone of low privilege to high privilege because my voice would out me as an American, and immediately the conversation would flip to, oh my God, you're from the States, what city are you from, and tell me about Donald Trump. I had to talk a lot about Donald Trump over the last 2.5 months. So I was both and, right? Those were both part of my experiences. And it can be really hard to wrap our heads around the complexity. And the idea of the work we're doing today is not to try and solve this problem, because that's not going to happen within the space of the time we have. But I want you to just embrace that sometimes things don't make sense. And sometimes you're looking at things that are simultaneous. And part of the work we all need to do moving from here is explore what those intersections are. And then the final thing I would say is to be confidential. So I was joking with Andrew earlier that you guys kind of broke my Twitter account yesterday. thankfully. But we're a social media happy crowd. And it's great to tweet everything up until this point. But what I want to ask for the next 50 minutes is if we can put down our phones and just be really present in this space. And when we get back to the report out section, you can feel free to sort of tweet some of the ideas that come from that. But even when we leave this space, again, own your story. If you want to share that and share that experience, great. But please don't share anything else that somebody else has shared with you, because that is their personal story to keep. So I'm going to ask if I can have a verbal agreement to these community agreements. And so if you'll just verbally and audibly say yes, that would be great. So do you guys agree to uphold these community agreements? Thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy, and she's going to help me with the next part.
Before we get into the meat of this, I just wanted to share that I have found this entire conference incredibly moving, and I find myself moved to do something. And I just wanted a show of hands. Is there anyone else in the room who's moved to do something? All right, so the first thing I'm going to actually ask you to do is to move. For the next activity, we would like people to sit next to people they don't know. All right, it looks like everybody's getting settled. All right, so while I'm going to turn the mic back over to Liz in just a minute, but to get started, this first piece is really about you and you personally. And so we're not going to ask you to write that on anything big. We're going to ask you to use either your green journal that you got as a personal reflection, or the Post-it notes. And I'll let Liz take over from here.
Yeah, so this first piece is just to cue us up into the later discussion, but I'm going to ask 2 questions, and it's to allow you to think about some things that are going to be helpful for as we talk further. And as Chrissy said, write it in whatever thing is most comfortable for you. This is something that you're going to be able to take with you when you leave from here. So just keep that in mind. So there are 2 questions. The first is to describe an experience when you had a positive interaction because of your race. And I want you to think about what it was like, who was involved, and how did it feel. The second question is to describe an experience when you had a negative interaction because of your race. What was it like? Who was involved? How did it feel? And so you're going to have 7 minutes to answer those 2 questions for yourself, each person writing individually. And we'll give you a little time check halfway through, so in case you're dwelling too much on one, you can move to another. And then once you're done with that, we'll move on to the next one. So you can begin.
All right, I think I'm going to turn it back to Liz in just a minute. But the first thing that I want to say is Maya has had the honor and privilege of facilitating many of these breakout sessions. We have thoroughly enjoyed it. We understand how important this is. We have lots of tools for helping people have difficult conversations. And so I will make the offer that if there are other conversations that need to be had, please don't hesitate to ask. And now now that most people are sitting down, I'm going to turn it back to Liz.
Okay, so I'm not going to go through, all right, I don't want to use my teacher voice. Still a little bit loud in here. Does anyone need a timeout, or are we good? So I'm not going to read through every idea, although I will say cheers to you, because there's a lot of Post-it vomiting happening, and that makes me really happy. I'm just going to read some of the ones that came up, and I will say what's really cool is that actually there were a number of common ideas across tables as we were just gathering, talking about things. Somebody would say, oh, there was this idea, and at least 2 other facilitators would say, yeah, I heard that one too. So the nice thing is that there's actually some coalescing of some things that can be done, which hopefully means that these things are not hard to get off the ground. So I don't know whether it's Pittsburgh or parties are just the thing to do, but there was there was a lot of requests for some sort of neighborhood block party or dance party, with the idea that it wouldn't, so on the one hand that it could happen within a neighborhood, but that also that it could be a way to combine two neighborhoods and perhaps get one neighborhood to go over to the other neighborhood. Crossover neighborhood events in general was something that was talked about, and I think one group went so far as to brand it called Cross the Bridge. So here's an idea, anyone in the room who wants to run with it. There was a desire to have neighborhood ambassadors, so someone who might just self-identify as, you can come to me and ask me a question about the neighborhood, or if you're curious or trying to figure something out, I am open, I am here, I am willing to talk to you. There was one that seemed something that everyone would be able to do in this room, which is once a day or once a week, say hello to somebody that you don't know, which seemed like a really easy, low-hanging fruit thing to do. A neighborhood porch crawl. I'm not sure if there is drinks or food involved with that, but I imagine that would make it happier. Some sort of neighborhood storytelling event to talk about the history or the culture of a neighborhood. Some groups also talked about the idea of doing a Pittsburgh park campout, where different parks might be open for people to come and do a camping day. A neighborhood passport, and I think this was connected to the idea of how can we get people to patronize businesses in other neighborhoods or even within your own neighborhood to learn more about it, and so that there might be a passport stamp that you could get for visiting different things in the neighborhood. I think that was...
Well, and I'll throw one in that I thought was really just like you could do tonight. Something very simple, read a book written by someone of a different race.
And learn something different. Nice. So some of these ideas that we talked about are things that it would require a couple of people or a group to get together to do. And some of these are ideas that each of you in this room would be able to do. And part of what I love in the simplicity of them is, like I said, this is something that you could enact on Monday or tomorrow if you wanted to. And so I would love that when you leave here and just think about some of these ideas, and I think there's also going to be some way that some of this is being pulled together, P4 organizers, that they can be displayed, that I hope that a challenge that I would give to each of you is think about what could I do to make one of these ideas become a reality? Or is there somebody who was here at my table or that I ended up talking to that I could partner with to make it a reality? Or is there some way that I can leverage the organization or the company that I work for or the neighborhood association that I'm part of to be able to work on this? I talk a lot about this idea of low-hanging fruit. That sometimes the easiest way to move towards really complicated things is just to start small. But if a lot of us start doing these small things, it does add up to some type of big change. So rather than letting the bigness of what we're trying to accomplish here be daunting and keep us from action, we can start with these little actions that are all within all of your reaches to be able to do. And I'm sure within at least a collection of a grouping of you to be able to do. So I hope that you will take away from here some of these ideas. I hope you also take away just a little bit of what the experience has been to learn about some of the stories that people shared. I often say that when these stories are shared with us, it's like somebody just gave you a gift. And I hope that you will hold that preciously and use it to start to think about what you could do to start to build a Just Pittsburgh. So thank you for your attention and also for your enthusiastic participation.